Right, so the title of the panel is Regulatory, Tax and Legal, and a Way Through the Jungle. And by the way, guys, no pressure, but the panel yesterday got voted as probably the best panel in any conference they've ever seen, so no pressure. So we have to do the same with this one, okay? And that means you don't have to be massively agreeing with, if you disagree on something, we want to hear that, because I promise you this was a very interactive audience. They told us what they thought yesterday, so please expect more of the same. So I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourself and what you're doing, and then we'll dive into the subject. And I think we'll start at that end. Please.
My name is the microphone? Yeah. My name is Marcus. I'm from Germany. I'm the head of the Young Economic Council in Germany and an association of young entrepreneurs. And in that role, I pushed for the creation of a blockchain association, which is basically doing lobbying with the German parliament, German politicians and regulators. And Germany is not the fastest moving actor here, so it's quite challenging at times.
Luka.
My name is Luka. I'm, as you heard, I'm in the blockchain space, but touching the legal side and also structural side. One of the projects we are now doing is the classification risk assessment functional model for blockchain crypto properties, that we can actually have a functional discussion of multi-jurisdictions. And in Switzerland, we have two main projects, so that we will actually create on the legal basis for a tokenizing factor for the BCP2s. That means the new type of security type tokens. And we actually assess the legal, let's say the legal and also the data protection side, if we would set up an application for a what we call sovereign identity system, which would help then the ecosystem for the whole KYC identification process.
We're going to go into that in a bit more detail. Luzius, please introduce yourself.
So I'm Luzius Meisser. I'm a computer scientist and economist. I do a PhD for fun at the moment in finance, where I build economic models. It's basically a SimCity for academics. And then I'm also involved with a few startups in Switzerland. I'm founder of the Bitcoin Association in Switzerland. I'm on the board of Bitcoin Swiss. And I'm also, for example, investor in Ledgy.com, which wants to bring shares onto the blockchain.
Thank you. Antoine, please introduce yourself.
I'm Antoine Verdon. I'm a co-founder of Proxies. We're an ICO project based in the Crypto Valley in Zug. We have a project, we have built a middleware, a bit like a WordPress for the blockchain, enabling any business to create a blockchain application and do what they would do previously in about 6 months in just 6 hours.
Thank you. So there are so many topics to cover on this one. And look, I mean, I'll join, if you like, your previous presentation and ask you to just build it a little bit more now, because this is a very mixed audience, right? A lot of them are just entering this world for the first time at this conference. This is what many people tell us. And traditionally, people understand the concept of property. But actually, you've had to go out, and all of us are having to think about a new definition of property. Could you explain that a bit more and what the BCP does?
You know, it's what we have seen in the past is that there are a lot of applications on, let's say, discussed and then being promoted, which are basically not blockchain or, let's say, decentralized ledger technology projects. So we had actually to start with a differentiation. Are we in the, let's say, old technology field, or are we really entering into the blockchain-based world? And the blockchain, since the blockchain allows you to create an information which could have the quality of a property, it allows you to have systems or systems for decentralized transactions. So you don't need an intermediary anymore for a transaction. You see, and that's the challenge. So that's we built on, let's say, we tried to figure out where is the first guideline to differentiate between blockchain applications or decentralized ledger technology application and old style technology, like ledger technology, legacy ledger technology, which we have. And that's the reason why actually that's what we started in 2016 with the regulators, to start to actually to deep into or to dive into this kind of analysis where we started differentiation. And let me quickly add on, you know, what people tend to forget is we are talking about software. We always talk about software. So even if it can have a legal, let's say, legal element or legal qualification of a property, it's still a software.
But in your paper, it was I enjoyed it because it told me that certain type of information, right, could be because of cryptography and because of this immutability and other things, could become a thing in the same way like a coin is a thing, right?
We made an analysis of a what we call in Switzerland eine Urkunde. What is an Urkunde in English? A document, a verified document. I try to avoid the term securities because then you have the US Americans. Now it's actually the thing is, if a blockchain information can be a document, a verified, notarized document, which is crazy. You don't need the notary anymore. You just can do it by technology.
Yeah, but I mean, I have to come back to the example you gave about property and the divorce in your previous speech, which was so interesting, because it's possible, isn't it, that the husband could have died and never disclosed the secret private key. So therefore, do you believe, whereas in traditional property, we have methods of recourse for that. So do you believe that the law needs to be changed? Now, that's the last one I'm going to ask you, then I'm going to move on.
Yeah, look, one of the, let's say, functional element of property is access to property. Access. Now, you have two types of property in the original, let's say, in the what we know the current legal system. One access is through a ledger, like the Grundbuch or Handelsregister. So you have a central ledger which actually is certifying your property. Or you have what we call the possession, the Besitz. Then you say, I'm holding this bottle because I'm holding is, we assume I'm the owner. Yeah. And I have now exclusively access. And that's a challenge. We have an exclusive access possibility through technology. What kind of property we do allow to expose to such a risk? So probably there will be some centralized recovery system in place if it's on certain type of...
The centralized word.
Yeah,
I'm going to come back to you on that, Luka, you know that. Marcus, I have to say that you retweeted my favorite quote from yesterday, which was the one about energy. Just as a side note, do you want to mention what that was?
The question from the audience was, doesn't Bitcoin mining use an awful lot of energy? Whether Jennifer's answer was basically, but how much does mining gold cost? An energy consumption. Actually, a friend of mine clarified that for me later. Per unit of value, gold costs slightly less energy than a Bitcoin, but not taking into account all the intermediaries for gold possession and gold transaction who also consume an awful lot of energy. So I think Bitcoin wins this round.
Let alone the chemical influence of gold. But actually, I wanted to ask you a bit more about this discussion, right? Because this is all new. And you kind of are saying that it isn't so much the regulators that need to change, right? Do you want to explain a bit more about what you're doing in Germany to help figure this out? Who has to get involved?
So the thing is, I have no clue about finance or law or tech. So I'm basically someone...
Welcome.
Nice to meet you all. So, but I'm in political communication. My day-to-day job is crisis communication, crisis management. So what I deal is with people who need to change their behavior or doesn't want their behavior to be changed. What is happening here, if we do have a paradigm shift, and you look at regulators, they are within the constraints to use the current paradigm to regulate a new paradigm. If you really want to have a paradigm shift, you need to talk to the people who can make paradigms shift, politically speaking. So what we are trying to do is we try to educate politicians, we try to enable them to realize for themselves that for their personal political careers, it is a wise decision to be concerned about blockchain, to think about new types of property. What you mentioned is completely true. It's not only true that old property can be expressed in a new way, we also see the rise of new types of property we couldn't imagine before. Like, for example, IP was not thinkable 100 or 200 years ago, intellectual property. Now it is a property class that creates whole industries. So we will see types of new property that cannot be regulated in the existing paradigm. And if we want the crypto enterprises to flourish, I'm not concerned about your regulation as financial people. I really don't care. But what I do care about is the enterprises you're investing in, the healthcare enterprises, the IP enterprises. How will they be regulated? Do we have a European market or not? Because if 2/3 of the states of Europe decide, well, I don't take a decentralized ledger for medical data, I just don't want to have it, the market is gone, your asset is gone. So we need to be concerned to have a conversation with politicians, healthcare politicians, financial politicians, law politicians. We have to talk to them directly and make them understand that it is in their benefit of their constituents to actually do something productive about it and to enable regulation.
Great message, and actually we're delighted that this conference, of course, has this amazing, the partners, the founders have managed to persuade Schneider-Ehrman to come here. I mean, that's really a big step, right?
Yes, so he is a multiplier who's incredibly powerful. Not in terms of actual holding power, but he can have conversations with people and change their minds in the political realm. And two things are always very dangerous when you see new technologies popping up and being regulated. One is pre-regulation, so you regulate the thing before you understood it.
Too quick. Yeah.
The Web 1.0 and 2.0 was not in that danger because at the moment when it was on the plates, there were already multi-billion industries. But the crypto environment is on the radar way before there's any practical use of any real product. So the risk of regulation before you understood it is very high. And the second risk is also very high. Regulation by false analogies. One example of my favorite regulation example of Germany is that we have YouTube channels that are regulated as if they were radio stations. So they need to comply with similar rules, they need to file files and documents. It is absolutely ludicrous because it is a stupid analogy used, but it is the current law and it wasn't changed when YouTube arose. So we have these two issues that we need to discuss with politicians, and if we do not succeed, we will have fringe markets. Probably there will be a flourishing market of medical files in Liechtenstein, but this doesn't help your assets, this doesn't help your companies you invest in. It helps Liechtensteinians, for example, but that's all.
Yeah. Antoine, I'd like to come to you now. Luzius, I'll be with you in a second, but actually I'd like to ask you, you're kind of famous for your sandbox initiative, brought people together to solve problems, and that's kind of what we knew you for. But you're now deep in this legal tech field, and you've just done an ICO. And in our conversation before, it was fascinating because there is so much infrastructure that's not in place yet. Can I ask you a bit more to tell us a bit more actually about the ICO, and maybe just quickly mention some of the problems you had to solve and how you had to solve them, and then what you recommend. Big question, but go for it.
Yeah. No, I mean, as an entrepreneur launching an ICO, it's really a true jungle you have to navigate. You have a lot of people ready to help you, a lot of people with expertise. Some of them have been doing it for longer than others. But the truth is, your project always has some specifics which are different from others, and people willing to help you and take a lot of money from you for that. Actually, they do it for the first time with your specifics, and you can become as much of an expert as they are, and you actually need to be, as an entrepreneur, you need to be deep into those topics of tax regulation to exactly understand what the risks of the project are. And there are so many steps we had to go through to have a successful ICO. The ICO is not done yet. It's going to be opened on Monday, but we had a successful pre-sale in November. And it's a quite different setup from what I was used to. I come from entrepreneurship. I was active in venture capital for some time, and previously you had the easy part, if you want, at the beginning, to create the vision, to structure the company, to create a product, and then the hard part was to get the first financing round, convince people that you had a great idea. Here it's the opposite. You have lots of money, very easily available. We could raise a 10 million pre-sale in 23 hours. But
you did a 10 million pre-sale in 23 hours.
We did.
Okay, I got to ask some questions. Did you KYC everybody?
We did, and I think that's a very crucial point because that's something which is quite new to the scene. If you look at most ICOs, they haven't done a proper KYC over the last years, and their issue is if they want to convert some of the ethers that they have collected into fiat money, they won't be unable to do so. I think we're quite special case because we said we are responsible entrepreneurs. We had 10 million pre-sale. We're raising 15 more million with our ICO on Monday. And so we have 25 million available for the project. And instead of speculating with this amount and keeping everything in crypto with the hope that it goes up, but the risk that it goes down and we can't execute the project, we said we're going to convert all the amounts we received into fiat in order to be able to rent a
How hard
facility.
was
hire
that to
people.
do?
And that was actually quite a hard process, because in order to do that, you need to give banks a very proper record of all investor KYC, AML details, and especially for investors investing more than 100,000 francs, banks want to have things such as a declaration that the money has been properly taxed from the investors, which is almost impossible to give, because if you had just $100,000 in Ether in January 2017 and you held everything, you would have today about 15 million, right? So how can you prove that this money has been taxed? You're going to make your tax declaration in 6 months. There will be some discussions with tax authorities locally, and you will have your final statement in 2019 sometime. So we had a lot of discussions with banks so that they can lower some of those information requests, to accept our funds. And I think we were very well placed, because we knew that from the start, and we got very good support. But for all ICOs previous to us, who, for example, just verified investors with a phone number, they will only be able to use the Ether in crypto, pay employees or pay any service that they can pay directly with Ether.
It's interesting because you came across some of the very problems that I think that your company is trying to solve. So I think that's quite interesting. But actually, the next step then, of course, is the use of proceeds. So for investors in your ICO, how do they know you will actually spend the money on what you say you will spend it on?
Well, we drafted a white paper, explained our vision to the investors, and we committed ourselves to realize this project in a certain time frame. There is no guarantee for ICO investors at the end that the project will come to life, especially for utility tokens. They buy token at the beginning of the project without seeing the actual functionalities. So the criteria we heard yesterday from several investors, I think, are key. Do you know the team? Do you trust them? Do they have a concrete plan to execute the project? Just like any regular business. I think if you can check all those boxes, then you should invest, but you shouldn't invest out of the blue in any project where you haven't checked that.
No, that's quite right. Luzius, I'm going to come to you now and ask you a question. I mean, how do you feel about ICOs? Do you love them, or are you a bit of a skeptic?
So I think it's great to see all these ICOs, because it's actually there's a big use case for the blockchain. You said there's no real use case yet, and the biggest use case so far is ICOs. It's a financing instrument. So, and I love to see this, because it's blockchain is very suitable technology for financing, for crowdfunding, for doing this kind of things. One problem we currently so I personally have never invested in ICO so far. So, and here we see some kind of...
this could change at this conference.
Yeah, it could. But one problem I have with ICOs, they're often kind of a hack from a legal perspective. So the founders, they try to raise something that looks like equity and smells like equity. I'm thinking of an example like Modum. They issue tokens that pay a dividend and that give voting rights, so it looks like a share, but then they do all kind of legal tricks to say it's not a share. And I think this only invites trouble. And in the long run, we should try to make it possible to issue actual shares on the blockchain for these kind of use cases. At the moment, there are legal obstacles to that, and we should make sure. I will try to talk to Johann Schneider-Ammann to convince him to getting rid of these legal obstacles. Because once we have real shares on the blockchain, we can distinguish between the startups that create a complex, unnecessarily complex setup to deceive the investors, and the ones that create the unnecessary complex setup because they have to, because the law is not right. So I think it would be very desirable to have actual shares on the blockchain. Once we can unleash that potential, it's also traditional companies will try to get on the blockchain.
I mean, just a word about Switzerland in this context, because there's so many jurisdictions. Most of these people are very international. What do you think Switzerland's role is and can be going forward?
I think Switzerland is in the pole position to become the hub for getting companies onto the blockchain. And I think it's also not an accident that Switzerland is in that position, because we are very decentralized. We have a decentralized political system. We understand decentralized systems, whereas others, the French, for example, they are centralized thinkers. They are skeptics. And for example, we have 26 different cantons with their own constitutions. That means we have 26 chances of getting taxation of Bitcoin right, and the French only have one chance. The Germans only have one chance. If the politician in Berlin screws up the chance is broken for all over Germany.
Sorry, that is my favorite quote already. Thank you. Awesome, Luzius. Thank you. Marcus, you were going to come back on something.
Yeah, about the uses. Obviously, you're right. It is used for finance reasons. But finance in and of itself is quite useless unless the finance is used to do something with it. It's not a mere storage of value, but you invest in something to make something happen. And so far, this something, what is going to happen? You know, industry-changing stuff, innovation, this something has yet to be found on the road. I know the concepts, I know the ideas are there, and I believe in them, otherwise I wouldn't sit here. But still, it is not yet there, which is what is different from the original internet, where the use cases were there, and then the money flew in. So this is the differentiation here.
Actually, Luka, I wouldn't mind come back to you on this for the moment. There's a question that I was asking, what should I ask this panel? And one of the questions that was about the use of foundations and governance. Is it the right thing, firstly, to use a foundation for an ICO? And how? And are we learning best practice, or is it already there?
You know, that's the challenge. What we have is what we discussed is you have a new technology, but you have an old existing legal environment. So you have to think what is the most suitable structural setup for a specific launch of a tokenized ecosystem. So, for example, for a token like modem or business tokens or let's say application tokens, a foundation is absolutely not suitable. And that's another issue. The term ICO is so very misleading because there is not a type of ICO. Does not exist. There are so many different types of launching a decentralized ecosystem. And what we will see is we will have three types. What we already identify 3 types of launching tokenized ecosystems. Yeah. One type will be what you just mentioned. It will be the security type. We need to have a way how we can print the shares on the blockchain. And that will be a very efficient way how to finance a company. The second type, which is the protocol infrastructure launch. For a protocol infrastructure launch, such as a protocol like Ethereum, I'll give you an example. In which you do not have an owner, you don't have a stake, you don't have a stakeholder. It's fully decentralized infrastructure. It also depends. The success of such a decentralized infrastructure finally depends on the user, how they use it, if they use it, and do they confirm transactions. You know, for these kind of projects, and only for these kind of projects, the foundation is a suitable legal structure, because the foundation, particularly Swiss foundation, is not like other types of foundation, has no beneficial ownership structure, is a fully legal entity supervised by the government, audited, and works like a smart contract. Once set up, you can hardly change it. So once you actually contribute in the foundation, the funds are locked in there.
That's hugely important for investors to understand. Absolutely. That very last point.
Absolutely,
you said, right?
And protected in there and supervised by governments, so that you have large amounts of assets which can only be used according to the purpose of the foundation and should be used according to the purpose of the foundation.
Read what the foundation is for, is your advice, right? Make sure you understand it as you invest.
Absolutely, and I think for me, when I see now how many future protocols will be launched, because this is the highest level of technology, I don't think many, but there will be. And there should be also a variety of protocols. We should not have actually rely on one. Yeah. You know, should be, and people should have the option to say, okay, I will base my activity on this protocol, on this protocol.
Exactly. Antoine, you wanted to come back at that point.
Yeah. The foundation model, because we looked into the foundation model when starting up our project, and it's very well described by Lucas. I think it works like a smart contract where you define funds for a specific purpose, and then they can only be used for that purpose. But our issue with that was that if you're an entrepreneur, you've probably realized that in order to come up with a successful project, you need to change 2 or 3 times the direction the project takes. So also, if it's important for the investors to understand that the funds will be kept in a specific specific directions. It's also a risk because from an entrepreneurial perspective, you don't have the flexibility to change and say you're going to be something slightly different than what you planned. And also with the whole regulation setup, the Swiss official foundation surveillance, the obligation to do all deals at arm's length and to compare market providers when you give money out. We looked into that model and we didn't understand if we would have 20, 50, 100 million in a foundation, how we would be able to get this money out in a time frame which would be suitable for the project.
Antoine, I'd like to ask you another question, if I can, about, because you're, the founders of ICOs are compensated with tokens because they issue them to themselves, right? Whereas the difference of a company is you own the shares. So that's right, you issue the shares or you invest in the company and you own the shares. So let's talk about capital gain, because at the moment, if you sell your company and you own shares, there is a capital gain, and the difference in Switzerland, you have, you're not taxed on it, it's fine. What happens, or what is your current understanding of the gain in the value of the token that founders hold, and what should founders do to make sure they prevent themselves, from inappropriately exposing them to tax?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, which was a big focus for our fundraise. I think there some type of maybe not regulation, but at least best practice from tax authorities would be welcome to understand how to apply to token sales traditional rules that we have for company creations. So if you are an ICO entrepreneur and you launched your token, as you said, the rule is that usually you get between 5 and 10%, sometimes up to 20% of the tokens for the team as an incentive, and as a payment also for all the pre-work done for free until the time of the ICO. Then on a personal level, you have two types of issues. You have the capital gains tax when you do an exit, when you sell your tokens, and you have the personal income tax. And the personal income tax is very problematic. If you create a Swiss company, you invest 20 or 100,000, depending on the structure, and that's money you have invested. And then upon exit, all the difference between those 100,000 and the exit price is tax-free, the capital gain. In a token setup, it's very unclear. Most projects until today, the founders just received the tokens. If you would do the same in a corporate setting, if you would receive shares of a company for free, then that would be considered a revenue. And if you receive tokens in value of several millions at the time of the ICO, then do you pay taxes on an income of 2, 3, 4, 5 million? And if you do, so what happens if at the end of the year you have this wealth because you just ICO'd and you have as a founder maybe personal wealth of 5 million theoretical in token, because mostly usually you have a certain type of vesting, and suddenly the token crashes. I don't think the tax authority will care about that. They will ask you to pay the full amount compared to what you received. So there are some things that we did at least as a team to try to mitigate this risk, trying to make a parallel between founding a company, creating an ICO, but it's a big personal risk.
I was just reminded, I just looked around and I saw Frederick there, and of course he was he didn't have much time in his presentation, but there was a whole slide on the current status of those and the taxes. So I don't know if those slides are available, but if you've taken a picture of that slide, tweet it, because the PwC team obviously understands. But Luka, is that right? Is that the current status, that we don't the token is taxed differently, when actually that is the founder's proxy for equity or value in their business?
Yeah, look, that's why we always urge the authorities and the tax authorities to look at the functionality of the token. It really depends what the functionality of the tokens are in order to make a tax assessment, And when I just started before that, what kind of types of tokens I see in the future, it will be protocol tokens, application tokens, the equity tokens, and then we will have product tokens. So actually access to services.
Well, actually, let's talk about that for a second. Yeah?
And then the product token, there we have a VAT issue. And it's completely different. That's why you have to really make a thorough assessment. If you launch an ICO, people, and it's, as you said, people focus on regulation, but they should also focus on tax at the early stage, because it could be that the tax authority comes and say, hey guys, you launched here a product token, a key token, which is a prepaid service. Guys, we want VAT on it.
And actually, I mean, let's deal with it, because we had a conversation before, and I asked you, well, you know, what do you think we should be thinking about? What is not yet fully explored? It's this topic. It's where you have project tokens circulating within products, right? Do you want to talk about that a bit? Luzius, go ahead.
Just a quick question. Isn't a voucher VAT free? And you could just say it's a voucher?
I don't know.
So
I'm not a tax expert.
Frederick knows. Go see Fred.
So one comment here. What I see here is analogies, a lot of analogies, right? You say, is it a product? Is it a voucher? I do believe what this scene needs to do is set up some kind of think tank to develop a new way of dealing with that. And just introduce a new category. Because if you were dealing in equivalence all the time, you will encounter problems, because you will not always share 100% of the properties of the equivalent you chose. So in the best case scenario, you would have to ICO a think tank that is crowdfunded by the whole scene, and that employs the 50 top lawyers of the world to develop a new thing. That would be a wise thing to do.
Oh, I'm in. I always want to employ 50 lawyers. Everybody does, don't they?
Oh, you get so at it. No,
Close the door.
Actually, I fully agree. That's the reason why we started with this functional concept, because we said, okay, we don't want to name it like an MME concept or a Swiss concept or whatever. It's an open source concept to which everybody can participate, that we dig into the technology and functionality rather than just to early adopt what we already know. Because this is the dangerous. And I tell you something else. I was in Malta. We are advising the government of Malta. And you know what they did as well? You know, they said, guys, I think there is too much discussion about financial regulation. We forget about consumer protection. Because, you know, we could have a fully regulated, whatever regulation applied, blockchain, and it does not work. You lose more money if it doesn't work than it really. And that's why they say, okay, first we should also, after we have decided whether or not we're already in blockchain, we should make a second decision. Is it really financial market relevant or not, or is it just a product?
I'm glad you mentioned Malta and other countries, because I want to come to the topic of sovereignty in regulations. But before I do, just to remind you, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to open up for questions. We don't have as long as we did yesterday for questions, and I think yesterday we wanted more. So please bear in mind your questions, and we will come to them in a second. Hold that one. I see we already have the first. So make sure you catch my eye, secure your place, and if the ninjas with microphones can get in place. Oh, 1, 2, 3. Start looking for the people who have raised their hands. Raise your hands now if you've got your questions ready, and station yourself next to them so we can make most efficient time. Raise your hands. Are we going to ask a question, please? Put your hand up so that the people with the microphone can stand next to them. That's it. Got it. And so now quickly on sovereignty. So we've been looking at this topic in some detail here, which is it possible that because of the distributed nature of blockchain and the way that these things are traded, that single sovereign regulation isn't fit for purpose for this? And if so, what needs to happen to have transnational or wider sharing of this? Who wants to take that? Somebody's vaguely politically active, I think. Go on.
So the thing is, any market only exists if there is some form of free flow, right? And currently with Bitcoin you have an absolute free flow of global free flow of all activities, for the good and the worse. I mean, yesterday the killer application was called Bitcoin, but actually I think the killer application for cryptocurrencies was the dark web. This was the first real-world application where people earned money with selling drugs and you name it. You named it yesterday. So what I do believe is, if you want to have one working market, you need to find, for example, the EU that adopts an innovation, a legal innovation that has been developed in one of the cantons, maybe in Malta, maybe in Delaware, and to actually push forward in a concerted effort to have a very high up regulation that is liberal enough that the market is created. Then other regions will certainly find their own ways. China will find their own way, the US will find their own way, Europe will find its own way. And then after a while we have the WTO, and then we have some kind of negotiations, and then we will probably finally in about 10, 15 years time, maybe 20, find a global standard.
I think, Luka, that's a little bit like you were proposing with your BCPs, right? That there is a framework, but then flexibility. Is that the way to go?
I think this is the realistic approach. We need to actually respect sovereign governments, sovereign regulations, but we actually should also have a framework. It's like a protocol. So our aim is to actually develop a protocol that everybody talks about the same thing. If you already have achieved a protocol discussion level, you have achieved a lot. I mean, they can do whatever they want on the regulation, but at least they understand it is the same thing.
Luzius, are we smoking our socks?
So I completely disagree. I think we shouldn't have a global standard, because at least not in the next 20 years. Because a global standard means that we create a regulatory monoculture. And this is a huge risk, because it destroys the opportunity everywhere if we get it wrong. So what we should have is a decentralized approach, where every country can do its own thing, and one of them will find the best. And after a few years, maybe it takes 10 or 20 years, we will find out which is the best approach. And
I'll let you come back with Marcus
can
first.
copy that. But we do not need a commission or some a group of experts that creates a law for everyone. So that's
exactly what I meant. One of those countries will come up with a legal innovation that will really be the best thinkable at that moment in time. And this best thing should then be pushed into European legislation, but be subject to change, obviously. If another innovation comes up, they need to be open to change. And this is the hardest part of it all. The EU Parliament recently introduced legislation that luckily didn't go through, that demanded that with AI technology, AI should be forced to explain itself, right? Which is ludicrous. It is a senseless regulation. Luckily, it didn't come through. But this is the body we have to deal with. But you cannot say, well, we just don't deal with them, because if you do not communicate with them, if you do not engage, stuff like this will happen. And this will be catastrophic for us all.
Please put your hands together for my panel. Thank you.